And we are almost live. Bear with me. Okay, we are live. So I want to welcome everyone tonight. Thank you for joining us on our live today and on Zoom for our new weekly 30-minute Know Your Rights series. This series is brought to you by a number of organizations and coalition partners in an effort to extend our reach and get you the information that you need in this moment to meet your needs. We will be covering a variety of issues week to week, and you can catch us on our Facebook Live or register through Zoom. The way that we are going to run this meeting is we will have a 10 to 15-minute presentation from our guest speaker with time for Q&A, question and answer towards the end. I will be fielding questions coming through Facebook Live and through the chat function of the Zoom call. You may also use the raise hand function feature to ask your question. I should also say my name is Annabelle Santiago. I'm the grassroots coordinator with the Coalition for Social Justice. And today we have Isaac Simon Hodes with Lynn United for Change with us here tonight, covering the topic around housing. Isaac, I'm so excited to have you here with us tonight to kick off the very first of our Know Your Rights series. So I'm going to hand it off to you to kick us off.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here with you and with everybody. So I'll just quickly go through some resources and information that might be helpful to tenants, also homeowners and activists, advocates, organizers, and people who are working in their communities for social justice and are going to come across housing issues, whether that's your main focus or not. It's such a pressing issue that, it's really important information to have. Please feel free to post questions or comments or corrections in the chat box, or we'll open it up to questions in a few minutes if you're not able to use the chat and you're on the phone or something like that. So I guess the first thing is I'll talk a little bit about our experience in Lynn and what we've found helpful. So obviously, there are a huge number of people across the state who have lost income. And the primary issue that comes up a lot of times is, how do I pay the rent, or how do I pay mortgage? So the main program statewide that can help people to pay their rent is called RAFT. And typically, a tenant would apply for help paying rent after they've fallen behind. They would apply through their regional housing agency. And in a minute, I'll give a list of those. People who work in housing locally will already be familiar, but for people who aren't, in the Boston area, it would be Metro Housing Boston. In Lynn, it's the Lynn Housing Authority, and in other areas, there'll be other agencies. So I'll post that list shortly. A few important things to note about RAFT. Typically, and a lot of this is changing, so I'm just going to give the information I have now. But typically, RAFT would pay up to $4,000 for tenants who are behind on rent, but they'll only do that after you've fallen behind. So you can't apply ahead of time. People are eligible for RAFT regardless of immigration status. So in a lot of other programs, we know there are barriers. In RAFT, you do not need a social security number. You do not need work authorization. People can qualify across the board. I am not an attorney, so I'm not going to give legal advice, but from my understanding, based on discussions with immigration attorneys, this is typically not a public charge issue. And I know there's a lot of fear and concern about that because of the awful things the Trump administration has done to create barriers and make people afraid to apply for benefits. As far as I understand, the RAFT program, because it's run through the state and for other reasons, is not considered a public charge issue. So if you have concerns about your own immigration status, or if you're working with people who do, you may want to consult with a legal aid immigration attorney or other immigration attorney. But from what I understand, this is not a public charge issue. So undocumented people in Lynn that we've been working with have been applying and receiving RAFT funds. So those are some of the positive points of RAFT. Additional funding has been allocated by the state because we know with the COVID crisis, there's just so many more people. We already had a housing crisis before COVID, and this has made it, even worse. So more money is coming in, but often the agencies that administer RAFT will run out of money. So it is important to get an application in as quickly as you can, but they'll be allocated additional funds little by little. So we do think more is coming. The state has also supplemented or added more along similar lines to RAFT with a program called IRMA. But in general, someone who is behind on rent should apply through their regional housing agency for your area. And typically they'll let you apply for several different types of help at once. Some of the barriers we've hit, and if people have questions about this, please post it in the chat. So one thing we've run into is RAFT in similar programs, they send checks directly to landlords. We know that a lot of people in our community in Lynn and in other areas of the state rent from people who are not the landlords. So that's often referred to in Spanish as an encargado, or someone who is sort of the middle person who rents an apartment or is in charge of an apartment and then rents to other people. And you might have multiple families in one apartment renting rooms from an encargado. That can be a barrier because RAFT is not typically set up for that, but don't give up. We've worked with our housing agency here, and they typically, at least here, they'll work with us to try to get around that issue, but it is somewhat of a barrier for some people. You may have to provide assistance so that people are able to figure out who is the real landlord, and either through the encargado or middle person or directly with the landlord explain, look, we can get you rent paid, but we do need a signature in a form filled out by the actual owner of the building. Sometimes landlords do not want to participate. There's a really short form that a landlord needs to fill out to get paid. It's pretty basic information about, who the tenant is, what the address is, how much rent is owed. They also need to fill out a W-9 form, which is just to confirm for the housing agency that the right person's receiving the money. Some people see that form because it's an IRS form, a government form, and they worry that it means they're going to get in trouble with the government, or it means that their taxes are going to be messed up. The W-9 is really not a big deal, but some landlords worry about it. So you may need to either have someone at the housing agency, or if you're working with a nonprofit or community group, help explain to the landlord that the W-9 is just a bookkeeping form, basically, so that the agency can confirm where they're sending the money to. So those are some of the barriers we've hit. Another important thing to note is that before COVID-19, in order to apply for RAFT, a tenant needed to have either an eviction notice or a notice to quit, which is like an official notice from a landlord that says, if you don't leave, I'm going to take you to court. or you needed to show a summons to court that you're really far into the eviction process. That rule does not apply right now because of COVID-19. So all you need is a letter from the landlord. In some cases, it might even be acceptable, a text message or email, but something saying, you know, the tenant's name, the address, the landlord's name, and how much is owed in rent. You know, so-and-so owes me $1,400 for the month of July rent at this address. That should be enough. So you do not need to worry about getting an eviction notice. So there's a question in the chat. How can tenants find who administers that? So I'm going to post in the chat a link to the state website. I think typically, I think there's only a few, but I don't want to give the wrong information. So I'm going to post the link in the chat. And I'm also, for people who are not on the chat, I'm going to read the phone number that you can call to ask who is your regional agency. I do know offhand in Lynn, it's Lynn Housing. In the greater Boston area, it's Metro Housing Boston. And for elsewhere, if other people know, you can chime in. But anyone can call 800-224-5124, and that'll be able to tell you who's the regional agency. Again, that's 800-224-5124.
And for those on Facebook Live, I'm posting the link in the comments right now. And I saw that there was another question coming from someone on Facebook Live, Diana, for the rental assist, the RAF program, will it just be partial rent or a whole month that people would receive?
So as far as I understand, and there may be some differences in different agencies, what we've seen in Lynn is typically if a tenant owes, you know, let's say $3,400 in rent, they'll pay that amount. And in some cases, the rest of the $6,000 will be applied to an additional partial month. But I think it may depend on the particular situation or on the agency. But typically they'll pay up to $4,000 and they will try to cover all of the rent that's owed in arrears. And the number, the maximum amount that you're allowed either is now or may in the future be changed or increased. And I've also heard discussion that the rule, which normally is you can only get RAFed once in 12 months, you have to wait for a year to get it again, that may also be changed. So I think the bottom line is if someone's behind in rent, they should call and apply. And usually it's a two-step process, at least here and in Boston. You have to do a pre-application, which they've been doing online. Then after that, you'll submit documents and do some kind of full intake. That can be really confusing and annoying for people who are already stressed. So I really encourage people, if you know, if you're an organizer or activist or with a group, provide support to people. So you know, they may need, if you're referring people to a regional agency, give that information to them. Here's the number to call, here's what to do, but let them know they should call you back if they're having issues with it. Here in Lynn, it was a real process for us where at first applications were only being taken online in a difficult to use form. So we were documenting who was applying, helping people apply, and we're able to meet with our housing agency and show them that there were, you know, that form was creating a huge barrier, particularly for people who were the most vulnerable, who had the lowest income, the least access to technology, who didn't speak English as a first language, in some cases didn't speak either English or Spanish as a first language. So they adjusted, and now they do allow people to do pre-applications by phone. Your region may vary, so you know, provide backup and try to keep in touch with people. And if you are personally applying, if anyone on the call is, I'll post a link as well, but you can feel free to call the local social justice or housing tenant rights group and see, if they can provide some backup as well. So I'll provide in the chat some links.
Great, thank you, Isaac.
Yeah.
I do want to open it up for questions and see if anyone on Zoom has questions. I'm still keeping track of questions on the Facebook Live. But can you say a bit about the moratorium extension?
Yeah, absolutely. So should I just very briefly go through what the moratorium covers and then talk about the extension? Okay, great. So, some people on the call may know, some people may not, that we do have an eviction moratorium in Massachusetts. So that means that in our case, all parts of the eviction process are banned. And that means that a landlord is not allowed to send a notice to quit or an eviction notice or a notice to leave. A landlord is not allowed to take a tenant to court to try to evict you. A landlord is not allowed to change your locks or show up at the house and threaten you or tell you to move out. None of those things are allowed. The only exception is if a tenant is, if a landlord says that a tenant is doing something that's breaking the rules and is a danger to health and safety. In that case, the landlord is allowed to go to court, but they still have to go through a court process before they can evict anyone. But that's very rare. So if someone is behind on rent or has some other dispute with the landlord, they are not allowed, period, under state law, to send a notice, to threaten you, to shut off your utilities, to take you to court. None of that. And I'll post a link to a summary of that. The moratorium also provides some protections for homeowners who are having trouble with their mortgage. So for example, foreclosures are not allowed, and homeowners also have the right to pause the payments on their mortgage with those payments put on the end of the loan. Some banks are respecting that and some are not. So I'll post a link to the resources on that. And if you feel like your rights are being violated as a tenant or a homeowner, you should call the Attorney General's office, and you should also call your local housing justice, tenant rights, or housing group if there is one. So the link to a summary of the eviction moratorium protections are now in the chat. One last thing about the moratorium is it does provide some protection against negative credit reporting. So if anyone's worried about a landlord putting a bad mark in your credit because of missed rent, I think that in general, that's pretty rare. But if you do want to protect against that, the law says you need to send a notice in writing to your landlord that lets them know the reason you're unable to pay rent is because of an impact of COVID-19. So in many cases, it's a good idea if you miss rent to send either an email, a text message, a letter, anything in writing saying, that you're sorry you couldn't pay rent. It's because of an impact of COVID-19. You're going to do what you can to pay or get help. And, that can also help the relationship with the landlord.
Isaac, I see a question in the chat. Won't tenants have to pay back rent in full once the eviction moratorium ends?
So currently, there's no rule in place to cancel rent. So, technically everyone will still owe the back rent. What we hope is that in many cases, if a tenant's behind on rent, before the end of the moratorium, they will be able to get help from a program like RAFT or IRMA or other funding to pay back that rent. We also hope, and we'll talk about it later in the call, that we can pass new legislation that would address that issue and make sure that people cannot be evicted after the moratorium ends. But that's a really good example of why the moratorium's helpful, but it's not enough, and we need to keep fighting. But I do want to emphasize in Lynn, what we've done in my organization is, of course, if someone's doing okay financially and they can pay rent, they should. But we really emphasize with people, they have to protect, their family's health and well-being and security first, in terms of food, in terms of basic necessities and medical care. If that means that they have to choose between, being able to have a healthy diet and medicine or rent, that everyone's going to make their own decision. But we think that, the immediate need of food and medicine and things like that have to come first. And, we're hopeful that, in Lynn, we're going to support people and fight to protect them after the moratorium too. But that is a reality, that the rent is still owed. And I'll talk in a minute about what we think is a solution to that. So in the announcement yesterday, to answer your question, so the governor extended the eviction moratorium by 2 months. So I think roughly October 18th, give or take a day, or I think October 17th, I'm sorry, is the new expiration of the eviction moratorium. That does not mean that if someone's behind in rent on October 18th, a landlord can show up and throw them out. All it means is, if we don't win more protections, and we hope we will, but if we don't, it means that starting October 18th, landlords could start the eviction process, which is a long process. It requires written notice and then a court date and lots of other steps where tenants have the ability to defend themselves.
Isaac, I know we have a few minutes left, and I see a question in the chat. If you could just briefly touch on what IRMA is and what it is. And then I also see, what about House Bill 5166 and how long before it may be passed? And then maybe move into the housing stability bill to close us out.
Thank you. So IRMA is very similar to RAFT. It's basically to help people who are behind on either rent or mortgages. It's a recent sort of new thing that the state put in place with about $20 million of funding, which sounds like a lot and is a good step, but is nowhere near what would actually be needed. So like RAFT, IRMA allows, I think, up to $4,000 for households to pay either rent or mortgage that they've fallen behind on. And I think you apply through the same agencies as the RAFT program. So, and I think it's a little more flexible in terms of a higher income limit. So it allows, people who might not qualify for RAFT to, to qualify for that.
And can you apply for both?
I am not sure how agencies are prioritizing that, so I don't want to give wrong information, but at least in our area, you would apply to the same place. So they may decide, how to prioritize the application. If you don't qualify for RAFT, they'll put you into IRMA. I don't know that you can get both.
Okay. Well, thank you, Isaac. And how can we advocate for more housing protections in this moment? What can people do right now?
Great.
And
so thank you. So, and that's one of the chat questions was House Bill 5166, which is the Housing Stability Guarantee Bill. So that is the bill that housing justice, social justice, faith-based organizations, unions around the state have come together to support and help to create, which we think is a real solution for the longer term. It would not leave tenants worried that as soon as the eviction moratorium's up, they're going to have to pay back an impossible amount of rent. So that bill is really critical. It would give basically a year of guaranteed housing stability after the COVID-19 emergency ends. That means no rent increases would be allowed for that year. That means no fault eviction would not be allowed for a year. And it means that tenants who missed rent because of the impact of COVID-19, whether it means they got sick or whether they lost their job, they would never be evicted because of missing that rent. So even after the emergency's up, a landlord could not say, hey, you missed 3 months of rent during the emergency, pay it back or you're evicted. That would not be allowed. So the housing stability bill also does provide some protections and help for homeowners and for small scale landlords, people who own, maybe a couple of triple deckers and who are local. The bill also really helps them with mortgage deferment and priority for housing stability funds. So we think it's a really important bill. In order to get that passed, we need to make a strong push before the State House ends its session, which is most likely July 31st. So only a little more than a week. And that's the time period we have. So for individuals on the call your state representative and state senator and tell them, please pass the housing stability bill. And I'm going to put a link here that gives you a tool where you can just punch in your address and it'll tell you the name and number for your representative and senator and an example of what you can say. For people who are on the phone, it's www.housingguarantee.org. And that has both English and Spanish versions available. So people should, spread the word. If you're working with an organization, please, let people know, circulate that, get that out on your text or email list. But that's the critical step, is to put some pressure on the legislature to make it a priority. We are really, really stressing we need to do it by July 31st. If that doesn't happen, we're not going to give up and we're going to find other ways to press for that. But we really want to make a strong push in the next week.
That's great. That's great. And you're saying the link that you shared is people can find a script of what to say to their legislators when they've called?
Yes, and also it'll, based on your address, it'll tell you exactly who it is. And if you put your phone number in, it'll actually connect you and call you right back with the right office on the line. So it makes it really straightforward to do that. And if people with organizations or local networks are not able to use that tool because people don't have computer access, you can use the information there to send out the information. And I'm going to paste another link that's a really quick way to look up someone's legislators' names and numbers based on their address. So if you're on the phone with someone and want to help them make the call, you can just look it up real quick using LegMap, like legislaturemap.org. So that's legmap.org, and that'll allow you to look up that info.
All right. This is really great information, Isaac. I really appreciate that you joined us tonight to share this information and kick off our the first of our Know Your Right series. I see that we are at 7:02, and I just want to close us out.
Could I add one thing really quick? I'm sorry.
Of course.
Okay. I just want to add, anyone out there, if you're with an organization and you want to connect and join the statewide movement for housing justice, and we're really glad to be here with CSJ, with Coalition for Social Justice tonight. We so appreciate your work. Please go to the website I'm about to post. You can sign on to the letter and connect with the broader movement. Individuals, if you make those calls, we'll make sure you're updated. But Homes for All Massachusetts is the coalition that I work with, and we would love to connect with everyone's local organization. So I'll post that link right now, and I'll be quiet so you can close us out strong. But thank you very much.
I see that there's actually one last quick question. Hold on one second. Elizabeth, sorry, I don't see it. Would you mind reading it?
Okay, I'm can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was posed by one of the participants saying, I'm having a problem with my lease, finishing at the end of the month. I'm sharing an apartment with other roommates, but most of them will move out, and I'm afraid that without them, I won't be able to keep the place. I just wanted to put out the word that I'm from Greater Boston Legal Services, and our services are really for people who are like basically being evicted, which I regret that we're not sufficiently funded and staffed to help people before they're at the risk of eviction. But I'm going to put my email address in the chat and just invite people who have a specific question. I can give them information about how to contact the Civil Legal Aid Program. Okay. I'll say my email address also. It's ewhiteway@gbls.org. And, you know, depending upon where you live and where you're at, you know, you may be eligible for some civil legal aid. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll make sure to share that on the Facebook Live comments as well. All right. So want to close us out here and really give a huge thank you to Isaac for being with us tonight. Next week, I mean, we're going to continue to run these Know Your Rights series weekly. They're 30-minute sessions, just a very quick top line information and ways that you can advocate for more rights. Next week, we will be covering unemployment insurance. Unemployment assistance, and we'll see you next week.
May I say something?
I'm gonna take us off of the live. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.